let's go to Q's and A's, and Mary has the microphone here, and I hope that Anita Dunn doesn't ask the first question.
Chris Dugan from Goddard Global. My question is actually to both of you. We've seen massive cuts in the British economy driven by the coalition government. Do you think that there is an appetite in Washington for such radical cuts on both sides of the fence?
Are these microphones working? We'll find out.
I suspect there's not much of an appetite among the Democrats for radical cuts, but I'm not too sure there's an appetite among the Republicans for cuts either, because the experienced Republican leadership will know that if they can't do this in a bipartisan, both parties need cover if the deficits are going to be addressed, as I pointed out. So I was actually at a meeting with heavy Tea Party representation a year and a half ago. The Republicans did a very smart thing, and they used the August recess a year ago to have a lot of representation at congressional meetings. It got to be huge. And I went to one of 2,700 people and was the speaker about the health care bill. And it was pretty even. There were a lot of Tea Party people there, but the Obama for America people had cranked out some representation as well. About 2,700 people. So I asked for a show of hands. How many of you are on Medicare? 1,000 people roughly, about 40% of the audience raised their hand. How many people would give it up? 4 raised their hands. So if you, for example, seniors who voted overwhelmingly for Republicans in this past election, 69% of them don't think Social Security should be privatized. So I'm a little skeptical. I know the dogma among Tea Party folks is we should have smaller government, but in fact, when their own personage is involved, they're not so important, so big on smaller government. So I think it's a very, very tricky thing. I personally believe we do have to make really substantial cuts across the board, including raising taxes on people who can afford it, because I really think the deficit is a huge danger. But the politics is very, very tricky, and one thing I absolutely agreed with about Brad is the presidential politics around February is going to kick in, and everybody's going to be amazingly sensitive to how everything they say on the floor is going to have a direct effect on what happens in 2012, and it's going to make it much less likely that you're going to have any kind of a bipartisan solution because they don't want to expose themselves to the kind of ads that both parties will use in the soon-to-be presidential election.
Well, the first key you're going to see is what's the appetite for cuts, is in the American system, we can add onto a bill a rider that authorizes certain expenditures without it going through House committees or Senate committees to decide whether it should be part of the bill. The House is going to make those riders illegal, and the Senate, or the Republican House, is going to make them illegal, and I'm hopeful that the Senate will make them illegal. That's the first time you're going to see if there's an appetite for cuts, because if they do away with that, it could be an appetite for cuts. There are other little things that could happen very easily, but the big appetite for cuts, I'm not sure it's going to happen either.
Let me just add to the question that many Republicans see David Cameron as Barack Obama's biggest nightmare, because basically the British have taken the austerity, we must cut route, and the Obama administration says the way we get out of this problem is to spend money. And if David Cameron proves to be successful, it's going to be very hard for Obama to say you can't go that way when Great Britain, which we so identify with in so many ways, goes that way. If they're successful, it'll be very, very hard for him. And this is, so there are a lot of Republicans, a lot of Tea Party people who are focused very, very carefully on what is happening in the UK.
Also, Tom, do we have any Germans here?
Yeah.
Who's German? Well, the Germans have a government that went the opposite direction of what America did. They cut expenses, they cut everything, and they reduced their economy, or their federal economy, and their unemployment is now what, 8%? And they're growing very heavily.
Okay, Mary, next question.
Brad Carl Kell from Bowling Green, Kentucky, the home of Rand Paul. Tell me the connect between the Republican Party leadership and Tea Party leadership as to communication about issues, cooperation, lack of cooperation, whatever subjects you might want to cover. How do those two houses of leadership talk to each other?
You have 2,500 Tea Party groups. Some of them are as small as 5 people, and some of them are very large. You have maybe more, but at least 3 national organizations. Tea Party Express, one that's run by Dick Armey, and the biggest one, probably of people, perhaps not of money, is run by 2 people who don't want to have a national organization. So what the communications is like is on an individual level. There are some candidates who have terrific communication, and the greatest communication is at the smallest level. These 700 new Republican state legislators and state senators worked with Tea Party units because those Tea Parties were comfortable working at the small level. Where they got uncomfortable is when they started working at a Senate level or a gubernatorial level. And as far as working with the national party, it doesn't exist.
Michelle Bachmann, a Republican congresswoman, who is very sympathetic, and even before the Tea Party, with their basic point of view, has talked about having a Tea Party caucus, i.e., within the Congress, to getting together people with like minds and having a Tea Party caucus. And that may be the first time that we see at the federal level or some kind of structure that really speaks for this. So the Republicans are going to have to see whether they can explain to Tea Party caucus members that incremental progress in the right direction is desirable as opposed to all or nothing. Well, I think the Democrats are going to have a hard time convincing their members who weren't defeated this time that they should follow the same policy of all those members who were defeated and go over the cliff as true believers. And so I think you're going to see difficulty in both parties in terms of trying to find their balance as we go forward, despite the new majorities that Republicans have.
I'd like to politely disagree with something that Tom implied. Most of the people who went over the cliff were actually conservative Democrats. There were very few. I think there were only 7 progressives that lost out of the 60 or so seats that we lost. And that's because the so-called blue dogs represented districts that are more conservative. In fact, that's where the Republicans were really strong. So I actually think you may get, I don't think this is going to happen, but it would if the members could do whatever they wanted to. You may actually get the Democratic caucus moving to the left as a result of this election, not to the right, because the leavening influence, if you will, if it is a leavening influence of the Blue Dogs, is actually much, much smaller than it was.
Well, I hope you do that. Please. All right.
Tom, has there been talk about having a Tea Party caucus in the Senate?
They talked about, well, all of this remains to be seen, but they actually talked about having, Rand Paul talked about having a Tea Party caucus that encompasses members from both the Senate and the House. I don't know the inner workings of the government at that level, but I don't think this has ever happened before. You've had caucuses in the House and caucuses in the Senate, but I don't think there's ever been a caucus that transcended both bodies, but this is what they're talking about doing.